Hi there, my name is Adam Fielding, and today I'm going to be talking about a few of the tracks I've written recently during my live streams and kind of dissect what's what in there, basically. So I'll also be taking questions throughout this stream. If you're watching on Twitch, please feel free to ask me anything via the chat. Nothing too awkward, although actually no, just keep it coming. Yeah, just feel free to ask me stuff. If I go over anything and you want me to explain what is actually going on in a bit more detail, please let me know. I've got a few techniques that I kind of glossed over when I was actually writing these tracks in the first place, and I feel like today would be a really good time to actually go over those a bit more and sort of explain what I was actually doing in a bit more depth. So yeah, so one thing I was sort of thinking about recently was actually doing some sort of like shorter form tutorials that I might be putting on YouTube in the future, just to kind of go over some of these little tricks that I've started using during these streams. So it's kind of interesting, like a lot of these like little techniques I've kind of been showing off during these streams have sort of permeated into my sort of regular day-to-day music making approach, really. So it'd be nice to sort of just reaffirm those and do some actual tutorials on them. So what I'm going to be doing today is just going over the past 3 tracks that I've written during these live streams, going back to the 18th of June with Curaga, which I have open here. So this is the sequencer track for Curaga, and I've got like a list of things that I changed. So what normally happens is during the streams, I will essentially create an entire track from scratch. If you're unfamiliar with the streams, I'll create an entire track from scratch and I'll do the whole thing on headphones, so my ears will be invariably fried at the end of it and there'll be mistakes all over the place. But for the most part, I will have a complete track. So what I tend to do is I come back to the track the following day with a set of fresh ears and listen to it using my monitoring setup and make some changes. Sometimes I don't tend to make a lot of arrangement changes just because I like the idea of leaving the arrangement alone. It tends to be things like mix tweaks and maybe like a few little transitional changes here and there, that kind of thing. So that's what I'm going to be going over today, and also taking questions and suggestions throughout. So without further ado, I'm just going to sort of sit back and play this track from start to finish and then talk about it a bit and what's actually changed. So I'm just going to shut up for a few minutes and play Curaga. So here we go. I've just realised actually this will have quite a heavy dose of limiting going on, so I'm just going to knock the input gain back a bit on there, and I'm going to do the same with the other tracks when I play them, just because I've sort of set my levels so that that's not kicking in. So if it's too quiet, turn it up. Right, here we go. So that's Curaga, and it was really interesting seeing the comments while that was playing because they kind of mirrored a lot of what I was thinking at the time as well. So I'd actually completely forgotten that I used the monotone bass in this particular track. Interestingly, for this track, I would say this is the one of the last three tracks that I sort of did the most with after the fact. So I did make quite a lot of mix tweaks. I can kind of see, I feel like this was very much a case of I had a rough idea of what I wanted to do, but the execution just didn't quite work. Like, I'm happy with how the track turned out, but it's not exactly how I wanted it to be, and that sort of irks me a little bit. So this might be something like an idea that I reapproach in the future or something like that. But basically, I've really, really enjoyed messing around with monotone, and I really like how that sounded. And it's nice to see there's a bit of a monotone fan club sort of popping up in the chat. Yeah, it's one of those things that I just keep sort of dipping into from time to time, and it's such a it's one of those synths that just kind of sounds good without having to do a lot, really. It's very simple and to the point. I'd say another synth that kind of has that same sort of feel to me is Poly 6, which is, it's like on the surface there's not really a lot you can mess around with, but it just always sounds good. So I'm not saying they sound similar or anything like that, I'm just saying that kind of approach of being able to dial in sounds quickly is very useful. So just had a message from Sevelius Pedraza. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name, by the way. That was probably terrible. It said, I'm new to producing. Any tips? I'm using Reaper but not sure what VSTs to download. I'd say don't go nuts on downloading loads of VSTs. I would say keep it simple. If you're totally new to the world of synthesis and sampling and stuff like that, I would say start incredibly simple. Like, if you're using Reason, but I realize you're not, but if you were, I'd suggest starting with something like the Subtractor synth, which is incredibly simple, and just understand the fundamentals of subtractive synthesis, because you can apply those fundamental principles to pretty much like 90% of synths out there, and then you'll have a better idea of kind of what works for you. So getting kind of a solid idea of how sort of signal flow basically works in your average subtractive synth is a good place to start. And sort of reading up on time-based sampling and how audio works is also a really good place to start. But don't go nuts and start, like, I would say absolutely don't start like messing around with stuff that's incredibly complicated. Like, you shouldn't be spending like hundreds of dollars on getting a super duper synth. Like, don't rush out and buy Serum and then be like, oh god, what have I done? I don't understand it. Like, start small would be my approach. But as for which VSTs to start with, I'm afraid you're kind of on your own there. But there's a lot of free stuff out there. JLux76 says, hey Adam, I've always wondered, do you mix with the master bus compressor on, or do you leave it all to channel compression and limiting? So I do actually really like the master bus compressor in Reason. I just don't tend to use it a lot nowadays. Why, I'm not entirely sure. I used to go through phases of using it, but even then when I was using it, I'd kind of use it with a light touch. Except I think the album that used it the most was, I released an album in 2010 called Lightfields, and I just completely abused that compressor all over the album. And I sort of wish I hadn't, because it just completely mauls most of the tracks that are on that album. But that's, you live and learn, and as a whole I'm happy with how it turned out, but it's not something I would do again. But I do like the fact they broke it out into a separate device. So, because I used to have one of the Waves plugins so I could basically bring it into Studio One, and because I do a lot of sort of project mastering in Studio One, and I've really missed being able to use it there, and now I can use it in Studio One. So excellent. Okay, thanks. And you said my name right. Excellent. I get basic editing, but I really want to know more. I'm looking forward to watching these streams. Well, unfortunately, I kind of feel like this, well, you might pick up something during this stream, but this will be more of a kind of dissection, sort of analysis kind of thing. But yeah, I should be writing tunes again during next week's stream. But anyway, speaking of kind of instruments and instrument choices, so again, I'd sort of forgotten that I used an instance of Maelstrom here. So for those who are unaware, Maelstrom was introduced in Reason 2, which came out in 2004, I think, or maybe late 2003. And it was awesome at the time, because up until that point, you had Subtractor and nothing else. And to be honest, I don't tend to use the Maelstrom a lot nowadays. I'm not really sure why, because it's kind of, I kind of like it. It's a quirky synth that was made by Magnus Lindstrom, who went on to create Microtonic and a bunch of other awesome things under the Sonic Charge outfit, which is excellent. But I feel like in this instance, I'm using an instance of Evolution to trigger chords, which is this chords player here, which is then triggering the pad. So I'm just going to solo that and just play a little section so you can hear what's going on if I just leave the rack open as well, and we can just see what's going on. Nothing. Brilliant. Oh, because it's not on. Right. I find it helps if there's a part where the pad's actually playing. So if we go here. So each one of those notes in Evolution is triggering a chord. Which I believe, it was one of the things I was going to mention. I've actually bounced all of the player parts to the sequencer lane because I wanted some consistency when I started exporting this track. So that's actually something I tend to do quite a bit. So if I tend to work, if I use players a lot in a track, what I tend to do nowadays is I will just bounce those player parts to the sequencer lane when I'm done with the track, so that I know that when I'm actually exporting the track, I'm going to be ending up with consistent notes every time, because some players do have a semi-random element to them. I'd actually say Electric Panda's players are really good for that, because they tend to use a seed value, and whatever plays in the sequencer lane one time will play the same again. If you go back and play it again, it will play the exact same notes unless you change that seed value or automate any of the parameters. And I quite like that consistency. But you can see here the beat map I've got here, which I was using to trigger all of the drums here. That's bypassed, and I've bounced all of those notes to the lane. So if we go over to the sequencer and look at the redrum lane, so it's just one solid clip of everything going on there. So it's neat. Buskin Bill says, I think we would all love some synthesis lessons from you. That's really interesting, actually, because I was just talking about that with someone who suggested, maybe doing some more topics during these streams. The problem is I really, really enjoy the flow of just writing music during these streams. But I feel like I could do a synthesis kind of thing. Like, I noticed one of my sort of most viewed videos on YouTube is a video about using Europa to create a big atmospheric pad. So going in with that kind of approach might not be a terrible idea, and then I might end up with something that I can use in a music making stream. So that's a good idea, actually. But yeah, it's kind of why I tend to rely a lot on presets or saved patches and that kind of thing during these streams, is just because when I'm writing music nowadays, I used to have a lot of overlap between sound design and production, sort of back when I first started out, and I think that may have been more out of necessity than any kind of workflow idea. So I would tend to just be messing around with a synth like Thor, which I actually did during this track. So if we go down here, we've got the sort of mallet Thor patch, which I can't play at the moment. So if we enable that and turn solo off. So that was a patch that I created sort of during the stream itself, and it was nice to just create something from scratch. So it's not the most complex patch, and I feel like a problem with this track, maybe there's just a bit too much reverb and delay on everything. I think I've reached a point where I realized I just need to chuck more stuff at this track, and I think that sort of didn't really work. Again, I feel like I had an idea for where I wanted to go with this track, and I just didn't quite execute it properly. But that could just be me sort of being overly critical of myself there. So again, like, going back to the Maelstrom, like, I really liked it here, but maybe that wasn't the right choice here, or maybe it was just that choice of patch just wasn't right here. Like, it was kind of nice at the start of Buskin Bills. Too much DR1. Did you really just say that? I know. I take it all back immediately. There's no such thing as too much DR1. Yeah, unfortunately, I do think that I think I've just used a bit too much, especially on stuff like the mallet. And like in retrospect, I feel like I might have dialed it back a bit. And it'll be interesting going forward to the next track and sort of seeing how it contrasts there, because I'm pretty sure I used a lot less reverb there. And that kind of raises an interesting point of one of my kind of own weaknesses when it comes to arranging a complete track is that I tend to have this habit of just throwing more and more stuff in as opposed to actually kind of progressing the track, especially during these streams, which isn't necessarily a bad thing because it kind of introduces a sense of progression and you're kind of varying things up in a different way. But I'm just using one block here, so it's the same kind of melodic stuff over and over again, the same melodies, same chords. I'm just adding more and kind of swapping elements in and out. And I mean, I know a lot of sort of electronic music does revolve around that, and there's nothing wrong with that in any way, shape, or form. It's just I do have a tendency to just take it to an extreme and just start piling more stuff on as a track progresses. But you know, I keep bringing this up as a personal bit of personal criticism, but I never actually do anything about it, and I think I'm the only one who's complaining about it. So right, I'm going to one thing I also wanted to mention, I kind of just wrote this down when I was actually listening to the track now, is one thing I would absolutely have done if I sort of went back to this track now is I would probably vary the drums up a little more. So I'm using Beatmap a lot here, and that was kind of triggering all of the drums, and excellent, fantastic, nothing wrong with that. But there's not really a lot of variety. Like I feel like I've varied the density on the kick and snare and stuff like that. But there's like, for the most part, it's just a very kind of static sort of kick and snare pattern. Like there's a bit of movement, but it's like I feel like I could have just done with more fills, more variations, that kind of thing. Maybe even some kind of glitchy effects. Maybe some stutter edit would have done the trick there. But it's like I don't dislike that. There's nothing wrong with using sort of a steady drum pattern, but I feel like a few fills here and there might have done it some favors. Ty Blue has said, I think you've used beat drum in every stream this year. Yeah, I think I have used Beatmap in every stream this year. It'll be interesting. I'm pretty sure I did in Cruise Control, which is the next track. I can't remember if I did in Wayfarer. It's interesting because I did actually write a track earlier this week, and I very, very, very nearly got away with not using Beatmap at all, except I got lazy and threw one in there to add some hats. So even with just adding some hats, I decided to throw Beatmap in there. It's such a good tool. Like I absolutely love it. It's great for just getting ideas going and rolling with it, and it just seems to fit what I do very nicely. So I'm going to talk a bit about what I actually changed in this track after I created it during the stream. So some of this will be kind of a bit not the sexiest stuff, I'm afraid, but yeah, so the first thing I did was I adjusted all the levels in the mixer, so it's kind of boring. So just with a fresh pair of ears, I was just like, okay, I'll just rebalance this a bit. So I'm just going to play a part of this track again and then talk a bit about kind of how I set my levels when I'm doing these streams, and then what I've actually changed. So if I just play this bit here. So the bass is a good thing to focus on here. So you can see with the bass, it's kind of a foreground instrument. It's you know, a very important focal point of the track, and it kind of drives a lot of what's actually happening. So I tend to kind of balance those at around -10 dB on the SSL mixer. So the bass and kick are the kind of the two main components in that regard. So they're kind of hovering just above -10 dB. I brought them up when I was actually messing around with the track after the fact. And I tend to find once you get the kick and the bass kind of more or less roughly locked in, you can kind of balance everything around that. So if we have a look at the pad, if that actually plays, it's not going to play now, is it? Right. So that kind of gets up to around -10. Again, I kind of feel like there's a bit too much of a tail on that. Maybe maybe a bit of compression, maybe, I don't know, but something to just kind of tame it without losing the presence. I feel like, you know, if I were to give this another pass, there are definitely things I would change about it. But yeah, so once you get kind of the kick and the bass locked in, then you can kind of balance the snare. or in this instance, the kind of more abstract, kind of clappy kind of sound. And, you know, you can kind of just, once you get a few core components locked in, you can kind of balance everything around that. That's generally how I approach things. And it works nicely when you're working on headphones, when you have to rely more on like a visual aid than anything else. Ty Blue has asked, do you keep the master fader at 0 dB? I tend to knock it down to minus 5 dB or 6 dB, but I'm not sure if that's right. There's nothing wrong with that. That's perfectly fine. I just tend to keep it at 0 dB. That's just how I work. Generally speaking, I just like to keep it a consistent 0 dB and use it if I want to introduce a fade or something like that. I can use the master fader. I generally, so this is more of a kind of personal approach. I tend to avoid automating the faders on the SSL mixer if I can get away with it. The reason for that is, so I came back to these tunes a day after writing them, and if I'd been automating a bunch of faders and I wanted to change the level, so let's say I automated the Vox Washers channel here, and so let's say I drew in some wacky curves here. And then I listen back to the track and I'm thinking, oh, actually, those vocals could do with a bit of a bump. So I'll just boost those by, oh no, wait, now the automation, it's not going to work because I've used automation. So I could use the input knob at the top, or I could introduce something in the rack to give it a bit of a bump, so like a Selig gain or anything like that. But, you know, ultimately, if I'm mixing the track, I like to be using the SSL mixer. So just not having any automation on there in the first place just makes it that much easier. And that's actually a habit that kind of goes back to when I was using older versions of Reason, and I was using the 14.2 mixer, which I'll just fire up here for illustration purposes. So if I create an instance of the... It's not an instrument, is it? It's a utility. If I create an instance of the 14.2 mixer, so in older versions of Reason, you didn't have the SSL mixer. You had to do everything in the rack, which meant that invariably everything would be routed through one of these things. So again, I would try not to automate the faders on the mixer, because at some point I might want to change the level. So for things like fades, I would just automate the master volume on the synth itself, or something like that, or I tended to use a lot of low pass filters as kind of a sort of fade effect, which is something that's carried on over into what I do now. I tend to use a lot of filters for fading purposes as well, just because I feel like it's a bit different, and it's in some respects it beats kind of a static amplitude fade. So that's a very long-winded way of me saying no, I don't tend to mess around with the master fader. But JLix76 just asked, is there a level you usually like to set your glitch drums at, or do you just mix to taste with your main drums? So I would generally consider those to be kind of a background element, so I would mix those to about minus 20 dB. So let's see what I've actually done with this track. So those are way back in the mix. They do kind of pop up at around minus 20 dB, and I do want to talk about the effect that's playing now as well. So it's basically to taste. In some tracks I'll want to crank that right up, and I think with the breakbeat percussion, like normally I would have had that a bit higher in the mix, but I think in this particular instance I just didn't really want it that high in the mix. So there's a bit of kind of having a starting point for important elements and then kind of balancing everything around it is kind of the way to go, and that's basically how I work nowadays. And again, like on headphones, having some kind of visual reference or clue that you can use for kick and snare and stuff like that is kind of it's very, very useful, because I'm not used to working on cans most of the time. I tend to use monitors. I basically just tweaked a whole bunch of levels and kind of brought everything up without touching the master fader, which I could have done. I could have touched the master fader, I just didn't. It's at this point it's more habit than anything else. I just have this kind of weird sort of quirk where I prefer not to mess around with the master fader if I don't want to, but there is nothing wrong with doing that if that's what you want to do. If you want to bring the whole mix down, just use the master fader. That's what it's there for. So I brought everything up just enough so that with the input gain actually turned on the maximizer, it's not going to work now because I've actually flipped that off, though I could just bring that back up. I think it was about 4.5 dB. So if I just get rid of the output gain. So if I play the track in kind of a really busy part of the track, you'll be able to see the limiter just kind of creeping in. So here we go. So you can see it's just coming in on the limiter, so that's fine. So I'm just going to set this back to how it was. In fact, I might just reduce the output gain a bit for this stream. So yeah, so that's been my general approach with these streams, is kind of bring everything up until the limiter's just kicking in, and then kind of balance it to taste. It's not generally how I would work with my own stuff. I tend to use a bit of software I've called R128, just to get kind of a rough LUFS value and just kind of go from there. Really, it's more of a kind of it's more of a numerical representation, but not kind of the holy grail of is this thing mixed correctly, are the levels correct. You do still have to use your ears for that, but as kind of a good place to start, that's kind of the way to go. So that's basically what I do with the levels. So in terms of bouncing everything to, like, all the players and stuff to the track, one reason why I did that, actually I'll get back to that in a second. Ty Blue has said, thanks. I tend to leave all the mixer faders alone as well, for the very reasons you just outlined. If I need to fade volumes in or out, I'll use the volume on the synth or an input gain. That's exactly what I tend to do. And it's worked for me so far. So yeah, I'm just going to stick with that. Seller gain is an excellent tool, like a sort of intermediary kind of rack extension for that sort of thing, just making sure the stuff is going into the SSL mixer at a reasonable level, in my opinion. But check it out yourself if you haven't already. It's a great rack extension. Sevelius Pedrazo said, do you have the same name on YouTube? Yes, I do. If you just search for Adam Fielding Music, I should pop up there, and you can check out all my older streams. So what was I saying? So I bounced all the players to the track. So not only does that mean I get a more consistent export, it also means that if someone opens up these tracks and doesn't have the necessary players or anything like that, they can still get all the note data. So it was a bit of the two, really, a bit of a this will be nice if people don't have the players kind of thing, and also everything will be consistent when I'm bouncing it. So yeah, so that was kind of nifty. And now's a good time to remind everyone, if you do want to check out these project files, they are all in a Dropbox folder. There is a command in the chat which I will just do now, so you can get a link. And all these project files are in Dropbox. You can grab them, check them out. Even if you don't have all the rack extensions or VSTs, if you have a Reason 11, you should be able to open them up and just have a look, and maybe get some ideas. So I also changed a few other things. With the drums, I EQ'd the lows because originally, like, I listened to this the following morning and I noticed the kick was it was like just being repeatedly punched in the face. Like I was drinking a cup of coffee because it was pretty much the first thing I did in the morning, and I listened to it and I was like, oh my god, just less of that. So I've got this kind of standard Eve MP5 setup, which is this is kind of my standard drum insert setup. So I've got an Eve MP5 EQ, which goes into a pulverizer for a bit of EQ, and then that goes into a limiter, which I'll get into in a second. But yeah, so there's the EQ compression and limiting on the drum bus, and because I had this EQ here already, I just attenuated the lows a bit because it was just way too much originally. So if I actually turn that down, I'll just play it with and without. So it's kind of funny because on headphones I cannot hear the difference between that being turned on and off, but when I was listening with my monitors and my sub, like, that was properly sort of, yeah, it was a bit much. So that also gave the mix a bit more space to breathe, which it needed because everything is swamped in reverb. So yeah, although obviously that's sort of the higher frequency, so it's a bit of a facetious comment. So I also ended up I EQ'd the lows, and I've also, so the kick was notched and everything else kind of around there was notched as well. And I also brought down the shakers. There were some shakers that were playing in the track originally, so that's where are they here? So they come in at the end of the track, and originally I think I had those, I was using my rule of sort of balancing about minus 20 dB, and they were just, it was just too much at the end of the track. Although listening back on headphones, I think that was all right. So I don't know. I guess it's just kind of a question of how I was feeling at the time. I also brought up the pad, so that was actually a bit quieter to originally. Went in the original stream. Buskin Bill said, "Did you just say you have a dedicated sub in your mixing environment?" Yes, It's a KRK. What's it called? Oh, I'm gonna have to look this up. But I've had it for years and years and years, and I won it in a competition in 2009. It was a propeller head competition to write a funky bass line, and that was part of the winnings was this sub, and I've been using it ever since. What was it called? I'm just gonna have a quick look. Yeah, I know it's got 10 in it. I just can't remember the 10S. It was a 10S. So yes, I remember just as I was looking it up. Yeah, KRK 10S, and it's really good. I don't tend to have it like it's there to basically extend the range of my monitoring setup rather than to kind of, because sub bass is satisfying. There's this kind of misconception, I think, that a subwoofer is supposed to enhance the listening. Like if you were sort of in a home theater situation, you would have a sub because it would accentuate the lows and kind of give you more bass, whereas in a dedicated monitoring setup, that's not exactly what you want. You just want something that can help the range of your monitoring setup. So my monitors don't extend, like their low range response is not amazingly fantastic, but that's what the sub's there for. It's there to kind of handle the low end frequencies, not to have the lows sound loud, but just to kind of extend the range. And sort of using it with that approach in mind certainly helps in terms of kind of mixing and monitoring, but it's just something I've got very used to now. And to be honest, with the size of the room I'm currently working in, it's probably massively overkill, but there we go. Yeah, so I'm just having a look at some other stuff I've changed. So I also, on the vocal channels, I also added a channel EQ just so I could give everything a bit of a gain. I could have used a Cellar gain rack extension here or anything else to just boost the amplitude, but I figured it's a Reason 11 project file. Everyone's going to have this EQ device. I'll just use that to give everything a bit of a bump, because up until Reason 11 there weren't really any dedicated devices where you had a numeric representation of the gain or attenuation that's being applied to a particular signal going through it. So that's a nice addition. I really like that. And it means you don't have to rely on Cellar gain if you want to have sort of a numerical representation of amplitude changes. You can just use a built-in device. So it's nice that they included that as a breakout box. I approve. I also tweaked the ending because I've realized that the end of this track just kind of went on for way longer than it had any right to. So that's one arrangement tweak I did actually make at the time, was I had the pads kind of fade out a bit sooner just because it really outstayed its welcome and I wanted to wrap it up. I mean, the track itself lasts about 5 minutes. I seem to recall at the time I moved everything over a couple of ticks just so it would actually get to 5 minutes, because I'm weird like that. So yeah, I tweaked the ending so it ends a bit sooner, and I also reduced the ducking that was occurring on the pad as well. So this is a trick I've showed off a few times before, but it's worth kind of going over again. So with the drums, I'm just going to play a kick. So that kick is actually broken out of the redrum. So the kick is on channel 1, and channel 1 is going into this Spider Audio splitter, which is splitting the kick into 3 different elements. So one of those elements is going into a disperser, and then it's going into a merger, and it's being merged with all the other drum channels, and it's going through the drum insert. So we can ignore that section for now because it's kind of doing its own thing. So the kick goes into here, and then that's being split into the pad channel, which is here. So it's going into the dynamics input on this pad channel. So when I enable the compressor on the pad channel, which I certainly have, it will be being sidechained with the kick. So every time the kick plays, it engages the compressor depending on the settings that are being applied here. So if I just open up the sequencer and the sequencer in the mixer. So if I play a part where the pad and the kick are playing, you'll be able to see it kind of kicking in. Or not, because I've turned it way down. So if I clear automation there and turn that way up, you'll be able to hear it much more obviously. So you get that kind of ducking sound. So you can emulate that kind of sound using rack extensions or effects. So one rack extension I tend to use quite a lot is called Pump. So if you apply Pump to this particular channel, then you'll just get like a very quick and dirty kind of pumping sound, which in its own right is incredibly useful. So Jalix76 has asked, how much of a difference is there in the Eve MP5 and the channel EQ? So this is kind of an interesting topic. I am by no means an EQ expert, but by my estimation, the vast majority of software EQs don't apply any kind of coloring to the sound. They just... An EQ is an EQ. It will work in the same way. How it works depends entirely on the actual curves and sort of slopes that it applies to the incoming signal. But for the most part, an EQ is an EQ. It doesn't tend to sort of saturate or color the sound unless it specifies otherwise. So the Eve MP5, it does have a saturation control on it, which I don't tend to use. But the reason I tend to use the MP5 is just because musically I find it to be a really good EQ. So what I tend to do is I'll sort of... This is a good example actually on the drum insert. I'll have the high boost set to 12k and then I'll boost it kind of to taste really. So if I solo that channel and just play some of the drums. So I'm just going to bring up the 12k boost and you'll be able to hear it. It's kind of, it's a nice boost without sounding really harsh. And I don't know the specifics of the actual kind of Q curve that's being applied to it. But whatever it is, it sounds, to me, it sounds musically good and it suits my workflow. So even when you've got that cranked right up, it doesn't sound really, really harsh. It just kind of makes it pop a bit. And you can use the 20k high attenuation to kind of smooth things out, which is what I tend to do in most of my tracks. So if I just dial that back a bit. So it sounds kind of brittle at the moment because we don't have the high attenuation. So if we just turn that up, it just kind of softens things just really, really nice. To me, it just sounds really musically pleasing. And there's nothing to say you couldn't do exactly what this does using the SSL EQ. Like you could just use the SSL EQ, just dial in like a 12k gain, or whatever you fancied. I just tend to find that in terms of what I do, I tend to get more musically pleasing results using the MP5, but different EQs will work for different people. And as Buskin Bills has pointed out in the chat, the Eve MP5 is an emulation of two Pultec EQs. One of the things that was kind of known for, it's this really interesting trick where you can apply the same amount of boost and attenuation. Like you'd think if you applied a boost and a cut to the same frequency band, it would make no difference because you're cutting and then boosting the same amount. But for some reason, boosting and cutting at the same time like produces this really musically pleasing effect, which I haven't actually done a whole lot during my streams. I don't tend to do a lot myself, but it does work and it sounds really nice. So I might actually just mess around with that now. So if we just, of course, the problem is I'm on headphones, so I can't really tell what I'm doing here. As Basketball says, they do something fancy to the selective frequencies. Like I said, I am not an EQ expert, and generally speaking, like an EQ is an EQ, but the main reason people tend to gravitate towards particular EQs is because the way they present what they do. It's more about the interface and how you use it. So, like I said, I think there's nothing I'm doing with the Eve MP5 that you technically couldn't do with the SSL EQ. I just prefer the way it's presented on the MP5, which is a massive oversimplification of how EQs work, and I feel like that's not really doing a very good job of explaining why I like using the MP5, besides the fact it works for me, which I feel like is justification enough. But there we go. So yes, that was a nice segue on EQs. Yeah, but I must admit, I actually bought the MP5 years and years ago. I think I picked it up originally like 2016 or something, and I didn't use it for ages because I bought it thinking, oh, it's a Pultec emulation. This is great. This is exactly what it needs. It's going to make all my mixes pop and sound great. And then I didn't use it for ages because at the time I preferred having my EQs represented as curves, and I've much preferred kind of a very graphical visual sort of representation, which is really interesting because it's not what a graphic EQ does. I've always found that quite funny. A graphic EQ doesn't provide you with an actual graphical representation, but there we go, that's a whole other thing. Yeah, years later I came back to it, and for some reason, sort of just the way it was laid out and how it was presented, it just clicked with me one day, and I've been using it since. So that was a weird one, but I just really, really like everything related to Coasa. Like everything they've put out so far, I'm a bit of a fan of. Some of my first rack extensions were Coasa guitar amp rack extensions, which I still use. So so I added some gain to the vocals. That's where I was going with that. And with the bass, I actually added like a couple of sort of bass drops and variations. So I'll see if I can find one of those. I can't see. Oh, there we go. So yeah, some of these sort of bass drops. I think there were far fewer of those in the track originally, and I really liked when I listened back to the track with my monitors. I was like, that's really satisfying. I've got to do that more than once in the track. So I just added a couple of extra drops here and there, and I also originally I've got this kind of growly bass, which it's more of a kind of fizzing kind of thing to layer with the actual bass. So on its own, it sounds a bit underwhelming, but with the bass, it just kind of adds that sort of fuzzy top layer. To be honest, I remember putting that in the track and I totally overthought everything about that. But originally, I did have a supercharger Native Instruments VST on there, which I replaced with a master bus compressor, so kind of going back nicely to that. I'm not entirely sure why I did that, to be honest. I think I just wanted to use a rack extension instead of a VST for the sake of it. But so yeah, that kicks in kind of between 0 and 4 dB. So it's not a crazy amount of compression, but it's just kind of helping to smooth things out a bit. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure why I replaced that, because I guess I just didn't want to use any VSTs for whatever reason. I guess that's the thing. If the track was full of VSTs, I would have probably left it. But because it was the only VST, it was slightly annoying me. So I decided it had to come out and I had to replace it. So there's also the mallet, which I changed. So I added a bit of EQ to the mallet sound. And to be honest with you, I think I may have overdone it with that. I think that 12K boost does make it sound a bit too sharp in the mix. But I think the 20K attenuation was absolutely needed. So yeah, Buskin Bills has pointed out the bundle of all three Kawasa EQs is £67. Well worth the purchase price, as the MP5 is £58. Wow, that's interesting. I think I got it on offer when it was like £30 or something. But I've easily had a ton of use out of it since then. So yeah, keep an eye on it. It's a great device. And if you've liked what I've been doing with it during these streams, and do check it out. That's the great thing about rack extensions, is you can try them for 30 days. And I fully intend to do that with Obsession. So I also, with the mallet, I also had a chorus on there originally, which just kind of made it sound a bit watery, and I took that off because it was kind of annoying. And I also notched the reverb and delay, because even though there is a ton of reverb and delay on there now, so if I just play a bit, I find it helps if I unsolo everything. So originally there was more reverb on that channel, which is interesting, because with the reverb's going into the delay, and to be honest with you, I would have swapped those round. So a nice little trick that I tend to do, and I've demonstrated this a few times, is if I want to reorder the signal flow of particular instruments in the rack in Reason, if you hold down Shift and drag the device, it automatically rewires things depending on where you place it. So now this is going, in the insert section, it's going to the echo, to the reverb, to the EQ. If I hold down Shift and drag it back up, it'll rewire it so it's back to the reverb, to the echo, to the EQ. Whereas if you don't hold down Shift, it just keeps the cabling the same. So it's still going into the reverb, to the echo, to the EQ, but now it just looks really weird and it's kind of a stupid order. So yeah, so holding down Shift is great. I still maintain that should be the default behavior in Reason, and you should have to hold Shift to not rewire stuff automatically. But I don't know, it's been that way since day one, so I feel like at this point it'd be a bit of a weird change to have an option. So yeah, one thing I also wanted to mention is this wacky effect that I've got going here, which is the glitchy percussion. So this is something I've actually used a few times before now. Even in my really, really old streams, this is actually an insert effect that's like, it uses all old stock devices, because I think I made it possibly back in the days when I was still using Record with Reason 5. So yeah, so it's lots of old stuff. So basically what happens is the input signal, and I haven't actually looked at this for a long time, so my apologies if I explain this in a really bad way. But the input so I'm gonna solo it so I can just play it and you can hear what's going on. So this is with the effect turned off. And this is with the effect turned on. So it's just kind of adding like these little glitchy sort of really, really rapid delays to things, which works really nicely with kind of poppy percussion. So what's actually going on here is the input is being sent into the Spider Audio splitter, and that's being split into two for some reason. So, oh yeah, one of those will be to provide the dry signal. But it's actually going into, it's being split and being sent into several of these DDL1 delay units with very, very small, very, very, very small delay times. Sorry, I've just noticed. Just lovely. Just had a tip for 420, blaze it. Love it. So the input signal is going into all these DDL1 delay units. And it's having like very, very, very small delays applied to them with the feedback being turned right down. So if that's the case, then you would just end up with like just one repetition every now and then. It'd just be kind of silly. So I've got all these matrix devices here, and these matrix devices are producing curves which are being used to control the amplitude and the feedback of all of these delays. So it looks really, really, really complicated. Like on the back of this, it looks like this is doing like basically some kind of crazy sorcery. But if you break it down, and I'm going to break it down because I'm going to delete all of these devices. I'm just going to look at one so you can see what's going on there. So it's just this one channel here, and that's having one curve. So I'm going to get rid of all these other matrix devices. So the input signal is basically going into this one delay that's going into a mix channel, and it's going into a mixer channel here. So the level of that channel is being controlled by a CV signal being produced by this matrix device here. So this matrix device is basically providing CV values that are controlling the feedback, the amplitude, and I think that's it of those everything going in. So you take that effect and you multiply it by sort of 8 times, and you end up with this really, really cool sort of glitchy effect. So yeah, so it, like I said, it looks really, really complicated. And if you have Reason 11, I would urge you to open up this project file and just have a look at it, because it's an effect that looks really, really complex on the surface, but actually kind of when you drill it down and sort of look at it, it's not really that complicated. But it does look very complicated. So yeah, in fact, I've actually created a folder in the Dropbox folder now called patches. So I do sometimes save these patches, and I think I'll save this particular patch to the Dropbox folder now before I forget again. So let's do that. Let's do that. Now, where is my Dropbox folder? Dropbox. Live stream patches. There we go. So now there's a patch in the Dropbox folder, in the Reason patches folder, called Delay Glitcher. If you don't have Reason 11, you can still open it up. I think this works with pretty much every version of Reason after Reason 4, so I think you'll be okay. Yeah, so that was a nice little segue. So all of this stuff kind of comes together, and you end up with sort of a bit of extra movement, and that's actually kind of an effect that I've used all over the place ever since. Like it's a really, really simple device, and if you want to add some variations, you can kind of randomize the matrix curves and what have you. These are just all random patterns, so I've just right clicked and selected randomize pattern on all of these. I know there's a shortcut for that, but I can't remember what it is, but you can just randomize all the patterns and end up with different results every time. And I've used it on vocals before. I've used it all over the place. It's a nifty little effect, and I genuinely can't remember how I came up with the idea for it in the first place. But it was one of those. I think I was at work at the time and got home, and just decided to sort of try and create it from what I remembered, because I was bored at work and just had this idea for a crazy effect. So yeah, so that's that really. So that's pretty much Curaga really. I think that's pretty much covered everything I changed in the track after the fact. So I'm going to move on to the next track and talk a bit about that. But one thing that's interesting about Curaga is, in terms of when I was actually writing it, I must admit I did not enjoy writing Curaga. Like I enjoyed kind of quite a lot of it, but I think by the time I finished working on the track during the stream, I just kind of had enough of it, to be honest. I'm still happy with how it turned out, but I think it's that whole kind of expectation execution thing just didn't quite align with me this time. But for the next track, it totally did. So I'm just going to open up Cruise Control, which is the next track, and I really enjoyed working on this track, and I'm just going to hope that it was... Oh, glitchy. Buskin Pills said it was the heat. It probably was the heat, because I remember it being incredibly hot. In fact, I'm going to take this opportunity to open the third track and just leave that in the background as well, because my computer just glitched when I did that. So let's just get that out of the way. Right. So I'm going to take that input gain off, and I'm just going to play the track from start to finish and keep quiet throughout, and then I'll talk about it in the same way as I did with Curaga. So here we go. So that was Cruise Control, and I'm really happy with how that turned out, because I haven't actually written any synthwave in quite a long time, outside of the occasional production tune here and there. So basically, I hadn't really done any synthwave unless someone had specifically said, "Could you do something a bit synthwavy?" So I noticed, thanks to Ty Blue for redeeming the Factory Soundbank bird during the playback of that. Interestingly, in case you didn't see the stream, I did actually sneak that sample into the track itself, which I was more happy with that than I should have been, really. So yeah, that was a lot of fun, and had a comment in the chat from Thor Inside. Excellent title, by the way. Said, sort of sounds like a loon, lake bird here in Canada. Named our $1 coin after that bird. So I think I knew it was a loon already, because I think someone had already mentioned that before, and it was, I think. Yeah, but today I learned, did not realize that the Canadian $1 coin was named after the loon. That's amazing, and it basically makes the entire of Canada better Reason users, as far as I'm concerned. So there, I've said it. Deal with it. So Jalix76 says, "You've got me wanting to purchase a lot, Adam. Damn, I have to quit watching these streams." Yeah, this is not a good track for that, I'm afraid, because this was the track that I wrote after I picked up Largo, which I only used for one synth, but it's really become kind of one of my main synths since then. And I did also use some Native Instruments stuff here as well. Thor Insight says, "Nice, I'll send you a loony sometime." Oh man, that sounds excellent. Thank you. So I did actually use a bunch of synths that I hadn't really used a whole lot of up until this point. And I'm just going to try and find the Largo in a second. But one thing, I think one of the reasons I really enjoyed writing this track is, oddly enough, is because I was actually relying quite heavily on presets outside of the instance of Largo, which was a very, very kind of simple patch that I created from scratch. So that was kind of my obligatory create a patch and then kind of everything will be fine sort of thing. So I'm just going to play that Largo patch because it is a really, really simple patch, but I just really like how it sounds in the context of the track. I mean, that is kind of the perfect sort of synth-wavy patch, especially when the filter is closed and you get that sort of nice envelope. It's just something I really, really like about the Largo filter, which is really interesting because I noticed some people talking about it on the Reason Talk forum, and they said they really, really weren't into the filter, which I thought was really interesting. But it just goes to show that, you know, everyone has different tastes, and what works for one person, it might not necessarily work for someone else. So I thought that was fascinating, and I'm super glad I picked up that synth because it just really clicks with me. Even its kind of ugly late noughties user interface gels with me. It's a joy to use every time I use it. And yeah, I'm super glad I picked it up because it was on offer recently for $30. Unfortunately, it's not anymore. But I'm sure I mentioned that at the time. But so that went through a bunch of effects and went through an instance of cassette, which kind of gives it that sort of dusty sound, and I really like that. Ty Blue has mentioned Sonic Academy did a remake of 808 States Pacific State. I need to check that out. I bet that's awesome. And yes, it's definitely the Loonbird sample. So yeah, there we go. Like I said, I think one of the reasons I enjoyed writing this track is because there's a lot of presets, and it just meant I could focus on just writing a track, and it was a lot of fun. And because of the nature of the track itself, I think those presets actually lent themselves really well to the character of the actual track itself. So there's an instance of Wave Station in here somewhere. Here we go. And that's just a preset. Like I didn't do anything with it. It's just a preset. I think I might have stuck it through some reverb. But I think that's very era appropriate. So here's Wave Station if you've not seen it before. Again, I think it's kind of interesting because the original user interface wasn't changed for about 15 years. This is a new user interface that Korg introduced earlier this year. And they also hiked the price of Wave Station, which I thought was interesting because I picked it up just before they did that. yeah, I actually, a part of me kind of prefers the older user interface, just because it's my weird late noughties synth user interface fetish. I can't explain it. But anyway, I just loaded up this preset, which is Brain Shifts, and I didn't change anything because I feel like the Wave Station just kind of lends itself well to that kind of early 90s sound. Tobler says, sorry, it was Point Blank Music. Oh, there we go. Point Blank Music did a remake of 808 States Pacific State. I'm definitely gonna have to check that out because that sounds super interesting and relevant to my interests. So it just kind of goes to show that if you... Oh, there's a link. Excellent. I'm going to copy that. So sometimes it's best not to kind of overthink... you don't have to create everything from scratch if you're writing a track, basically. It's that whole... You don't want to be in a position where you feel like you have to reinvent the wheel every time you work on a track just for the sake of it. Sometimes you just want to get an idea down, and I think that's why I enjoyed working on this track. So in terms of what I actually changed with this track, after writing it during the stream, I sort of made the same level adjustments, so everything kind of came up just enough for the limiter to kick in, kind of thing. That's a good kind of rough place to start, really. And I then bounced beat map to the track again, which is exactly what I did with Curaga, so everything's in the sequencer lane. Also, it was interesting because I was very tempted to use some classic drum machine samples, so like Lindrum samples or something like that for this track, because I felt like they might be era appropriate. But in the end, I decided to gravitate more towards some sort of modern samples and just stick a load of like an 80s gated plate reverb on them, just to kind of give it that right sort of era appropriate flavor. And I think that was kind of the right call. I think one of the problems I've had with writing synthwave in the past is that I've been too obsessed with the idea of using era appropriate synths. So again, I've used the Wave Station, which is sort of era appropriate, but you've also got stuff like Largo and a whole host of other stuff. And this Contact Analog Dreams instance, that was just a nice pad that sort of fit really nicely. So if I just solo that, because I do like the sound of that, I just unsolo everything. But I imagine that kind of pad wouldn't be particularly difficult to create from scratch if you really wanted to. In fact, maybe it's something I'll do in a future stream. Just a nice kind of stringy patch, just like use a few sawtooth oscillators and a nice filter to give it a bit of drive. I reckon you could pull something like that off using something in Reason, but I think that's for another time. So I've left the original player for the redrum in the track, so people can still check it out and see what's going on there. I've also, with the drums, I reduced the squash because they were a bit too compressed before. So I reduced the squash. This is the exact same setup that I had going on in Curaga, by the way. So it's the Eve MP5 EQ, pulverizer, limiter, and I think I've used a disperser here, which is on the kick. I think it's on more than just the kick, but I don't know, actually. Let's have a look. No, it's just on the kick. So the disperser is on the kick, and it's... Whoa, what the hell? Sorry about that. I didn't mean to deafen everyone. See, I had a bit of a delay feedback loop going on there. So disperser is also another kind of personal weapon of choice. It just kind of... I use it all over the place on drums, and I'm pretty sure I explain it every time I use it, but it's a super good effect. If you've never used it before, I'd suggest trying it out because there's nothing that really sounds quite like it. Buskin Bill says, is that a Thor lesson? To be honest, if I was going to recreate that particular pad, I wouldn't use Thor. I'd probably use something where I could dial in a bit more of a kind of crunchy tone with the filter. I don't know, actually. I don't know what I'd use, but probably not Thor. No, nothing against Thor, but I just feel like in this instance that wouldn't really work there. But so I also adjusted the threshold on the limiter on the drums, because originally it was just completely smashing the transients, and I didn't really need to do that, so I just brought that up to about minus 1.6 dB, so you're still getting a bit of a snap from the drums, and with the reverb on the snare and all that kind of stuff, it was just completely killing what was going on. So even now I think it kicks in quite a bit. Oh god, that is the worst pun. It was a nice thought. I'm just going to leave that to linger in the air. So you can kind of see the limiter's only really sort of engaging a little bit on the drums there. So it's still providing a bit of headroom for the rest of the mix, but it's not squashing everything. I also turned down the gated reverb on the snare, which at the time I thought would be kind of sacrilegious. But I think that was a bit higher and it was just too much. If I turn the reverb off completely, it does add quite a lot to the sound of the snare. So, but that's just an RV7000 using, that's a preset called 80s gated plate, which is kind of my go-to for that sort of effect. But the RV7000 is great when it comes to that sort of thing. I've also boosted around 12k a bit because that wasn't quite as high as it is now, and I also made a bit of a cut around 20k, so we're getting the snappiness from that EQ again, and also kind of just smoothing it out a bit, just as I showed off earlier in the stream. So something that I did like about this track was it kind of started, I believe I added this percussive layer quite early on, and it's at the start of the track. And that's just a loop that I ended up messing around with, which I believe, that went through an instance of Beatformer, which when I first picked this up, I picked this up in a bundle with a couple of other instruments, and I didn't think I was going to get a lot of use out of Beatformer. I thought it was a bit of a gimmicky kind of thing. I like to have all my controls laid out and sort of have more control over exactly what's going on. I'm not a big fan of one knob sort of controls that have ambiguous names like squash and air, but actually having used this, it's actually incredibly useful, so I have actually used it quite a bit. And squash is really good in terms of kind of, if you turn it below 0, it seems to apply an expander and a gate to whatever's going in there, so you end up with this kind of sort of more snappy kind of percussion. So I reduced that and increased the air, and we ended up with this sort of, well, if I bypass all of the effects, the loop sounded like this originally. With everything turned on, you kind of get the crispiness from the RX 950, and the Beatformer just kind of helps it to pop a little bit. JLix76 has said, quick note, anyone wanting a great and simple limiter, I picked one up called Frontier from D16 for free, and it's fantastic. I've heard of that, and I've never checked it out myself, but I have heard good things, and D16 stuff does tend to be pretty top notch, so absolutely check that out. That's a really good shout. Yes. So yeah, Beatformer, I've actually had quite more use out of that than I was expecting, and I used it quite a bit on the following track as well, Wayfarer, here and there. So Basketball says that loop was created with Rhythmic as well, wasn't it? It was. I used a sample that I recently acquired from Splice, I believe, and then I put that through this instrument called Rhythmic, this is all in the stream, by the way, and just rearranged it into something different and then processed it further. So I've got kind of a nice sort of routine now with rearranging loops and kind of creating new ideas from them. One of the keys to that, I think, is having, this is a super boring topic, so I'm not gonna dwell on it for too long. But one of the most important things, I think, with regards to loop manipulation is having decent folder and sample organization structure, basically. So with all the samples I get, I tend to bring them into Reason, set them to the tempo that they are actually set to in the actual file itself. So if the file says it's a 100 BPM loop, I'll bring it into Reason into a 100 BPM project, then bounce it out so that tempo data is stored with the file itself. So next time I drag it into Reason, it will just match the tempo of whatever I bring it into. It's a nice little time saver there, but I do wish there was a way of manually adding that tempo information to files, because as you can imagine, if you're dealing with hundreds of samples, that can take a long time. But once it's done, and I find myself much more inclined to browse through my sample library if I know I can just dip in there, grab stuff, and put it straight into a track. In fact, I do that with some of my my percussive Kontakt libraries. I've done it with Damage and Gravity, which are two big sort of libraries for more cinematic stuff, and I've just bounced everything out as audio because I prefer working with audio. If I can just drag something into a track as audio instead of firing up a Kontakt instrument, especially percussion, I just much prefer it. It just kind of it appeals to me more. But it is a faff to do it the first time you do it, I'm not going to lie. But once it's done, it's done. But that's just me. So I also brought up there was a cowbell here, which comes in towards the end of the track. So that's that was just a factory sound bank loop with a bit of delay added to it, and that was kind of nice. So something I've done here is I've used a pulsar to generate a CV signal, which is being used to control the panning of the cowbell channel. So it slowly kind of drifts from left to right. So if I turn that way up, you'll be able to hear it go from left to right. So left to the right. And we'll just continue to do that throughout the track. So that's kind of a nice way of adding a bit of sort of movement to a track, like movement to percussive elements. Jalek says Decimal and Devastator 2 are on sale for $29 on Reason Shop. Interesting. Yeah, I've got a few D16 plugins, but I just don't tend to use them, unfortunately. But I think it's more because I have other plugins that do what they would have done. So it's one of those things. So what else did I change? So on the ARP, I did actually increase the high pass filter. So if I just play that. So originally, I can't really tell what's going on wearing headphones. So yeah, I just rolled off the lows a bit. I don't think that makes a huge difference to the mix, so it was kind of freeing up a bit of space for everything else. I also, there's like this sad lead, which is a Poly 6 patch. So this is kind of a sound that I tend to go for a lot with Poly 6. So I tend to use Poly 6 for three very particular things. One will be kind of a sort of ARP sound, so like a nice, almost kind of 80s ARP. I tend to use it more, I was going to say it almost has like a sort of cyberpunky vibe to it, but it's very kind of synthwave friendly, and you can kind of get some interesting sounds out of it. Another is I use it as a bass drone. So because you can dial in those sounds, these sounds you can dial in really, really quickly, and as this kind of sad lead, which just has like a slow filter attack and release, and you can dial those sounds in really, really quickly. And I mean, there's not really a lot going on here. So in the actual track itself, I have adjusted the filter frequency, so it's it was very kind of sudden. I think it kind of came in very suddenly originally, or it didn't come in soon enough actually. So I've just changed it so that sound does kind of come in more quickly in the track. Cushion89 says Blade Runner lead. Yeah, I think I made that observation at the time. The problem is there's a danger. I feel like any sort of any lead that sounds like that, it's like a nice sort of slightly detuned sawtooth wave. It's just Blade Runner. People are going to say it's Blade Runner. So yeah, it's just a nice sound, and so I just stuck that through a bit of DR1, but that's pretty much it. That's just the sound coming out of Poly 6. So yeah, I do really like Poly 6. I think that's being high pass filtered as well, so it's just just to kind of tidy the lows a bit. Thor Inside says so detuned. It is. I think I used I've got like a slight bit of modulation on the pitch LFO here, but like it looks like it's turned right down, but it's at 0.08, and that is enough for it to have a noticeable drift. If I turn that up to 0.12, it's much more obvious still, and I've found that with kind of a lot of synths recently that they either don't have a control to modulate the fine tuning of the pitch of the patch, or they won't have the option to do that, or the actual modulation of the pitch itself is really sensitive, so you can't get fine pitch adjustments, which just kind of annoy me, because I like being able to modulate the pitch a little bit. But I've also used the analog control here, which also introduces a bit of pitch variation there, so there we go. So on the bass as well, I did the similar thing here to what I did with the drums in the previous track, Curaga, where I've attenuated the low band, which is set to 30 Hz here, just to kind of free up a bit of room in the mix, because originally, I'll play it with this bypass so you can kind of hear for yourself, but it's just like, it just frees up a little bit of room, so I'm just going to play that. So it's not a huge difference, especially when the filter's open. But with it just kind of brings the signal down to about sort of that's that sort of minus 10 dB target. And that just tends to work in this instance. So it's just a bit too boomy without that cut. But again, listening on headphones, I can barely hear the difference there. In fact, I can't really hear the difference. That was more of a listening back the following day, and I was like, oh yeah, there is a bit much going on there. So I'll just notch that ever so slightly, give the mix a bit of room to work. So again, it's that whole kind of, it doesn't make a lot of difference to the overall sound of the mix, but provides a bit more room for me to play around with, and I'm a fan of doing that. And originally, this Wavestation patch, it did come in a lot sooner in the track, so I think it came in at bar 17, whereas I realised listening back to it the following day, the track was still kind of developing there. I didn't want to rush everything in. Yes, Buskin Bill said, so glad you taught me to buy in VK2 at £25. Happy to help. Yes, it's a great instrument, and the bass in this instance is the VK2. So if I just solo that channel again, it's nice. And again, that was a patch that I dialed in at the time because it's incredibly simple. But yeah, just a bit of drive. Yeah, I really like the VK2. So I feel like the synths I've really latched onto over the past couple of months have been the VK2 and the Largo, both for very different reasons, and I'm going to continue using them, obviously. So it'd be nice to get the Legend in there as well. Buskin Bill says, I'm still after DR1, but it's never on sale. Yeah, unfortunately, it normally pops up in really good bundles around Black Friday. I think I bought it as like an effects bundle years ago with all the other Synapse effects, and it was totally worth the price of entry. But yeah, it was great. So there's also the pad, which was this thing. So originally, I think the high pass filter was much lower, and it didn't really sit well in the rest of the mix. So I just kind of used that to just roll off the lows a bit there. I also turned it up a bit because it was quite far back in the mix, and I felt like that's actually kind of an important part of the sound, is that sort of 80s kind of pad sound. So I brought that up, and it sort of sat nicely with everything else and balanced everything accordingly. So it's kind of, I mentioned that I did move a couple of things around, so the Wavestation comes in later in the track, and there are a couple of other little things. JLix76 says VK2 is my new favourite bass synth. Thank you, Adam, for that. You're very welcome. Buskin Bill says JLix76, he's a good bloke. I'm not sure if I'd go that far. I'm an all right kind of guy. No, thanks. I appreciate that. Where was I? So I was talking about the arrangement of the track. So I had that kind of come in a bit later. I also I was very, very tempted after listening back. So I'm just going to play this part of the track, sort of around bars 61 onwards. So originally, I was really, really, really tempted to try and add something else there. Because I was listening back to it the following day, and I was like, it's progressing really, really nicely. I just feel like I want to add something there. Like, that's my typical arrangement brain kicking in. And I realized I had the exact same thought. I came to the same realization that I came to earlier in this stream, where I thought, I don't need to add more stuff to this. There is enough going on in this track. It's got a nice, satisfying kind of flow to it. Just let it progress. Let it do its thing. It doesn't need extra kind of gimmicks over the top to sort of distract people. It's just let people enjoy the ride. So I didn't add anything to it. It's the long and short of that. I just wanted to kind of explain my thought process behind that there. So, and there's enough going on in the track. I mean, it's not a super complicated mix. In total, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So there's only 10 channels, only 10 individual elements. Some of that stuff's grouped together, like the drums, big deal. But, at the end of the day, it's not a long track. Like, it fades out starting at 3.5 minutes. There's enough there to sustain what's going on. And I thought it was nice to just let the ideas carry the tune, as opposed to rushing everything and throwing more stuff in there. So yes, that was my reasoning behind that. But I wanted to mention that as sort of a bit of the flip side of wanting to mess with the arrangement, was just sort of taking a step back and being like, actually, do I want to be adding more stuff to this? No, not really, because I have had tracks I've done during these streams before where I have added elements, and generally speaking, it tends to work. But this time, no, just left it alone, and I'm glad I did that. So that was Cruise Control. If there's anything anyone would like me to go over in the chat with regards to this track, then please let me know. Otherwise, I will just move on to the next track in a second. Just had a question. Adam, do you still work with Avatar One? I haven't seen anything by him in a while. Maybe I don't know where to look. I haven't actually done anything with him in a while. In fact, this is kind of interesting because I did have an email from Mike a couple of years ago, and he asked me if I wanted to work on something kind of synthwavy at the time. And unfortunately, it kind of fell by the wayside, and this is totally my fault. And you've just reminded me that I'm a bit rubbish because I never really got back to him about it. But he wanted to work on something synthwavy, and I said sure, I'll see what I can do. And then I got distracted by another project and didn't have time. And by the time I remembered it again, I'd completely forgotten that was the thing I agreed to do. I don't think he's releasing a huge amount of stuff now, but if I see anything, I'll let you know. Yeah, because I like his stuff, and he's a good guy. So yeah. Anyway, I will move on to the next track, unless I don't think there was anything else I really wanted to touch on here. But yeah, I'm going to go on to Wayfarer, which is the track that I wrote last week. So I'll just close this and hope it doesn't kill my computer. Oh, there we go. Right. So this is Wayfarer, which is from last week, as mentioned. So I'll just knock that back, and I will play the track from the start, and I'll keep quiet and talk about it. So here we go. So that's Wayfarer, and listening back to that, I'm really really happy with how that panned out, especially in terms of the arrangement and kind of how everything progresses. Mainly, and I quite like how it just ends. Like, I feel like it doesn't outstay its welcome, and it's also a rare instance where I've used more than one block during these live streams. I think that was a smart move. So I've had some really really interesting questions in the chat, so I'm just going to go over some of those now. Buskin Bills has pointed out that my tea has got to be cold by now, and it's not particularly pleasant, unfortunately. But unfortunately, I wouldn't be able to talk. So yeah, it's not great. So yeah, Tobly says, yes, the stutter edit track. So yeah, I feel like I need to explain this for anyone who didn't see the stream at the time. The reason this has so much stutter edit 2 going on is because I entered a competition a couple of weeks ago and won a free copy of Stutter Edit 2 for naming a musician who I'd like to collaborate with. So that was a nice fluke, and I won it the day before I was doing the stream. So I thought, well, I've kind of got to use it everywhere now. So I did, and it's a ton of fun, and I fully intend to use it a lot more on everything. As Buskin Bills said, new toy syndrome. Absolutely, 100%. I'm probably not going to be using it as much as I did on this track, but I was really happy with how that turned out, especially with the with how the bass moves later in the track. So it's just a static bass patch, but so this is how it sounds for the most part. So it's just a static bass, and with Stutter Edit adding some movement. Like, that's really cool, and I'd love to create some more patches like that just to put on bass parts to give some extra motion. And I've actually done that in a couple of tracks since the live stream last week, where I've just used it to add motion. So if you think of it less as just a stutter edit effect, which can be, if you overuse it, it can be a bit kind of gimmicky, I think, especially nowadays. It still has its place, absolutely, but I think kind of as a sort of modulation effect, it can be really cool. So JLEX76 said, I've got some novice questions. Is there a key command for adding a new note lane when separating the drum lanes? Not to my knowledge. I could be wrong. I tend to just right click and select new note lane. But you've got me curious now, and I'm going to have a look. I can't see one, but if anyone knows of one, please let me know. And also, you seem to scroll and zoom much faster than I do when you work. So the zoom shortcuts are G and H, and I use those all of the time. And the reason I can side scroll is because my mouse has a little wheel built on the side, so I do that a lot. And yeah, I don't really know. And also, if you hold down Control and scroll, you can zoom in and out like that. But yeah, that's pretty much it, really. don't really know what else to say there. But if I'm doing stuff that I take for granted and you want me to kind of explain, please let me know, because like I said, I do take a lot of this stuff for granted. It's just stuff that I do, I don't really think about. So yeah. Oh hey, Drabbit's here. How's it going? Serlin Henrik has said, going back to organizing samples, how do you label your percussion sections? Do you consider frequencies, timbres? So I'll just base, this is kind of interesting because up until relatively recently, my sample collection was an absolute mess. And it was just the worst. Like, I had stuff dating back to like 2000, 2001, which I was blatantly never going to use again, but I felt like I had to keep in the exact same location in case I wanted to open up these old crappy projects. So what I did was I just lumped everything into a folder called Instrument Archive, and that was my old sample archive, and I've set up a new section called Samples. So I do still have separate folders for stuff like Wave Alchemy. I tend to group a lot of stuff by whoever made it for the most part when it comes to instruments. So I've got all of my drum samples here. These are all like one shots. I tend to use Drumvolution a lot, and Evolve Free, that's what I tend to use during these streams. That's a free sound bank you can get from the Wave Alchemy website. Do check it out. Their one-shots are excellent. The Drumvolution Ableton Live pack includes separate samples, so it's just a ridiculously good sample collection. But in my new sample folder, there's so many in here, it's scanning the contents. So in the new sample folder, I decided to break everything down into instrument type. So this is basically all just loops. I've called this folder samples, but it is basically loops. So I've got some stuff for noise if I want to add like a bit of crunch or whatever to a track. So that's nothing particularly fancy. So if you go into the drums folder, go into drum drops, beats and breaks, so I'm trying to keep everything a bit more curated, really, and so everything is kind of the tempos at the start, and then in this instance it's kind of what the sample is. So you can see kind of at a glance what it is. So this is like a sample bank from Splice, and I decided to, so all of these are tempo matched to Reason. So if I were to drop that into this track, well, it's 128 BPM, so that would work anyway. But if I were to drop like 155 BPM sample into the track, it would be tempo locked. So I can just drop that in press play and it will match the rest of the track. So let's try that. I'm not gonna lie, I think that sounds kind of cool, but we're kind of digressing here. But that's the kind of stuff I wouldn't have done if I hadn't already tempo matched everything. So it is an extra step, and it is kind of a waste of time to have to do it in the first place. But once it's done, you can just drop stuff into your project, and it's really neat. So just for the sake of argument, we've got this loop here. Now I can just add a bit of beat former to it. So that's this extra effect here. Turn down the squash, turn up the air. Well, it's not an amazing effect at the moment, but like I've got folders for percussion, so it's mostly tops and that kind of thing, extra guitar loops and some sequence loops. So it's not like a super duper crazy extensive sample library at the moment. Like I said, I'm trying to keep it more curated. But what's there is, I know that what's there is good, and if I drop it into a project, hopefully it will kind of give it a bit of a zhuzh, which I think the problem with my old instrument archive is it was just full of everything that I'd ever downloaded for free off the internet. So it was full of a bunch of crap, which I'd kind of sometimes used in one place and was holding on to because I'd used something once. So in terms of sample organization, I'd say curation is very, very important. It's good to have some kind of personal quality control, with opposed to Thai Blue said, wait, you dropped a 155 BPM loop into your 128 BPM project and it tempo matched. Yes, that's because before this entire thing, I painstakingly dragged all of these into a separate project. So say this is 95 BPM, created a Reason project, set it to 95 BPM, dragged that loop into a separate audio track, and then bounced it out. So these are the bounced versions. So these all, they're the same. They're exactly the same as they were when they were brought into Reason. They just have tempo information included, which I really wish you could attach to a file without having to go through that process, because it's such a pain. But there we go. But yeah, that's actually made me use the samples I've got a lot more, because they're just ready to go. And it's like I said, it's the same with kind of other stuff like Damage and that kind of thing. If I've got the loops ready to just drop in, I'm more inclined to drop them in and slice them up and mess with them in an audio lane. So yeah, so that was an excellent question, asking about sample organization, that kind of thing. So Ty Blue says, well, that gives me the beginnings of a gentleman straightening. That's a phrase I've never heard before, but I'll gloss over that. So yeah, I'm sure there were some other questions. I really like the Vox wash. Yeah, I realized I didn't use the vocal wash or the nasal riser in Cruise Control, so I figured I could kind of get away with doing that in Wayfarer, bring it back in. So yeah, so what did I actually change? Well, one thing I noticed was that once again, I've only really got 10 channels here, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Oh, 9. No, it's 10. I just can't count. So there's only 10 channels again, but that's enough. The track only lasts sort of just over 4 minutes. It kind of gets in, does its thing, gets out. Again, I was sort of tempted to add some more stuff to the track when I came back to it the following day. Decided not to, because I thought there was enough going on. It held my attention throughout, so no need to do that. So one thing I really wanted to go over was this channel here called Breakbeat Madness, which I did explain while I was working on the track, but I kind of glossed over it a bit. So I'm just going to play that now. So there's no actual sequencing going on there. That's all being triggered by players and stuff in the rack. So I'll just play a bit more of that. So what I did there was I took a loop from the factory sound bank and split it into 4. I just straight up dragged it into an audio track, chopped it into 4 chunks, which I will grab now. And then I put them all into an NNXT. So So you could do that with any audio loop in the factory sound bank. Just chop it into 4, put it in an NXT. Once I dragged the samples in there, I right-clicked and selected Auto Map Zones chromatically. So you get all the samples starting from C1 and just descending one note at a time. Then what I did was I created a matrix pattern sequencer, which just triggers the notes one by one, so it just plays them all in order. So if I just press run here, it just plays the loop. It doesn't do anything particularly fancy, it just plays the loop as it is. Nothing else going on there. So I thought one thing I didn't really realize until quite recently is if you have a matrix device triggering samples in the NXT, and I assume other instruments, it overrides anything that's being triggered by players. So you've got kind of the basis of the loop. So you have kick, snare, sort of little fill, snare. That will always play now, so it will always play in that order. So you can use something like Evolution or perhaps Quad Note Generator. I haven't tried it myself, but I fully intend to trigger extra notes over the top of that. So I've set the low note to C1 and the high note to D sharp 1. So it will only play notes between this range here. So those 4 notes that I've already created. You could use more slices if you wanted. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. So if I just play the matrix device again, and now if I click run on the Evolution, it will start adding extra. Oh, it's not synced properly. So let's stop that. So if I just go back to the sequencer and just press play, so it's just constantly creating variations of that fill while still keeping the basis of the kick, snare, sort of fill bit, snare. It will always keep that basic, those particular slices will always play on the 1/16th notes. It will just add variations in between, which I thought was a really cool little trick. I actually tried something very, very similar in Curaga, and I meant to talk about that at the time, and I just completely forgot about it. But it didn't really work in that track because I didn't have that matrix device to kind of ground it in some kind of sane rhythm. So if I don't play that and I just play the Evolution, it doesn't really have much kind of rhythmic grounding to it. It just kind of sounds a bit all over the place, which is fine if you're not relying on it as like an important percussive element, like as kind of more of a background sort of element or a top or something like that, like a percussive top. But if you want to rely on it like as a breakbeat, that's not really a lot of use. So once you bring that extra matrix in over the top, it's got a nice sense of rhythm over the top. So I thought it was kind of neat, and I fully intend to use that trick again in the future. The only downside to that is once you've bounced everything to samples, you can't then change the tempo of your track because it will just break the timing of the samples. So if I change the tempo to 140 BPM, this will sound... It kind of sounds a bit choppy. That's actually not as bad as I was expecting it to turn out. So I fully intend to, in one of my future streams, do kind of like a drum and bass kind of break, like I was going to say breakcore, but I don't really want to do something super breakcore-y, but something kind of more drum and bassy using that technique to kind of drive the main drums, because I think that'll be super fun, especially combined with some other kind of beefier breaks and stuff like that. I mean, with that and Beatmap, it kind of writes itself, I feel. So that'll be really interesting to mess around with. Stick some stutter edit over the top, and we'll be cooking. We'll get a stew going. So yeah, so that was something I wanted to talk about. And Buskin Bills said, "Can you combi that and stick it in the patches folder?" I could. Let me have a look. I'll take the beat former out just so that we don't have that. And if I just... It's going to be kind of rough, but I'll stick that in a combinator and I'll save that. Why not? This patch can't be saved because it references sounds that self-contained in song. Oh man, I'll tell you what, I'll do this afterwards because I'd feel like this is not going to be a lot of fun to watch. So I'll say combinate break patch. There we go. So yeah, disco next week, followed by drum and bass the week after. We're up some fun. I didn't say drum and bass immediately, although I kind of want to do that now because I think that'll be a nice change of pace. And it has actually been a little while since I did some drum and bass. So yes. So what else did I change? So again, I made kind of general level adjustments so that when everything hit the limiter, it was just kind of engaging the limiter a bit. As kind of, that's, like I said, it's my standard kind of thing. And that kind of brought everything up to a reasonable-ish level. Again, I haven't really touched the master fader, but there's nothing to stop you from doing that. It's just weird. I feel like it's like a weird personal tradition at this point to leave it at 0 dB. It's like the holy master fader. I can't touch it. I don't dare to mess with the master fader. So yeah, so kind of the usual. And I did also turn down the kick because originally it was really, I think the length was turned right up. And so if I take that attenuation off, it was just a bit much. Yeah, so it was just too much going on in the track. So I reduced the length, turned the kick down, and just kind of gave everything a 30 hertz attenuation, which is kind of funny because, again, I can't really hear the difference with that EQ on headphones because it's around 30 hertz and these don't really stretch that low. But so that kind of just helped to, it's the drums, that kick still got its kind of weight to it, and especially with the disperser, but it's not completely overpowering the mix. Drabbit said, I usually feel the same. Don't touch the master fader, that way lies madness. Excellent. I'm really glad to know that I'm not the only weirdo who isn't touching the master fader. Brilliant. Although, yeah. Outstanding. Master fader avoiders unite. So yes, I also turned down the snare, which is interesting because originally I really wasn't sold on that snare when I came back to the track. I thought it was just a bit too snappy. Like, I don't know, it just didn't have, I felt like it didn't have enough weight to it. But listening back to the track kind of afterwards and with everything kind of going on around it, I thought it did work. I've just realised, I took the some stuff off here, so that's why the track sounds different. Jalek, he'll start out with drum and bass, but will most definitely end in chill trap. Oh yeah, probably. That's probably what I'll do. Start with drum and bass, then end up with, I don't know, like a 8-minute ambient drone. I was thinking about doing an ambient track this week actually, but then I decided it'd be more interesting to go over these tracks, and I feel like it's worked nicely. Something else I wanted to mention was I've really, really loved the pad in this track. Like, I don't want to go too much into that, but there's just something about that. I really, really like it. I'd say it's the most wavetable-y of the stuff I've created with Largo so far, which is silly because it's a wavetable synth. Surely everything is going to sound kind of wavetable-y. There's just something about that just screams wavetables to me, and I really, really like it. So, I can't really explain that one. Yeah, does anyone ever like their snare? It's I think this is the first track I really came back to after the stream, and I was like, that snare. So Drabbits also said, little known fact, Adam is the pioneer of lo-fi chill nasal trap. Oh yeah, I've actually got like that's my secret. I actually have like a secret stash of tracks I've been working on ready to bust out after these streams. So I've got my lo-fi chill nasal trap ready to roll. Buskin Bill says, sounds like you've already made a few tracks this week in secret. I mean, I am constantly writing stuff, so I feel like that's kind of why I did. That's another reason why I wanted to sort of take a step back and go over these tracks again this week. Is just because I thought it'd be a good time to do that and sort of just rest my creative muscle a bit. So I also turned down in the drums. It'd been a while since I had some bongos. I definitely need to write another track using more bongos. Possibly those bongos. Definitely those bongos. I turned down the 12k boost in this track because, like I said, I feel like that snare was just a bit too snappy, and attenuating around 20k a bit and kind of reducing the 12k boost a bit, that kind of helped to smooth it out. So it was really sensitive to that 12k boost. So if I turn it up, it's just, oof. It really wasn't doing it for me. So yes, I just brought that down a bit. And the percussion loop, there was this sort of percussion that comes in later. So that was just another sample that I decided to bring in. And I ended up kind of just taking that back a bit because I think I adjusted the low pass filter on this particular channel just because it sounded a bit scratchy without that on. So it's just something about it. It just sounded a little scratchy. So just by smoothing the highs rather, sort of starting around 12k, it just kind of helped to keep that under control. So at the pad, I also bumped up the high pass filter just to kind of smooth the lows a bit, because it's not really anything important going on down there with the pad anyway, and it sounded fine on its own, so I just kind of did that. With the breakbeat channel, this Eve MP5 wasn't here originally, and that is here solely for the purpose of smoothing out the highs. So if that plays, I keep bringing stuff up and not meaning to. So again, that just sounded kind of a little, not scratchy, but it just needed rounding off a bit in the highs. Even with, I had like another beat former before that, which was kind of making it sound a bit more snappy. But I've accidentally got rid of that now, so that's gone. That's gone. This is the track now. So with the bass track, I actually really like how the bass turned out. And again, like I really like what Stutter Edit did with the bass in that particular instance, and I just think it sounds awesome. And I fully intend to use it more for that kind of thing in the future. It's not even a particularly complicated effect in this instance. It just sounds good, and I'm all for that. So I did end up taming the lows in the bass a little bit when I was working on it. Where is it in the rack? There we go. So surprise, surprise, I've used the VK2 here again. But originally it was quite boomy, so I ended up adding 30k attenuation with the Eve MP5 here again. Basically, I got to a point when I was working on these tracks and I just started throwing MP5s all over the place. I would say, actually, between Wayfarer and Cruise Control, like in terms of what I was using in the track itself, in a way, it was kind of a much more kind of slapdash approach to working, just because I was throwing stuff in and seeing what would work, and I really enjoyed it. So I'm probably going to be doing that more from now on and not obsessing over individual details as much. So which I've been saying I'd be doing that for ages, and I just haven't. So and I really liked the ARP in this track as well, and like I totally did go nuts with the stutter edits, but I liked it. So that didn't have a high pass filter originally, but I've just added that to kind of tame the lows a bit again, because I only really need the lows for the bass and the kick. So yeah, so that kind of turned into a bit of an advert for Stutter Edit too, I think. And there's a pad wash which comes in later, which I must admit I kind of phoned that in at the time when I was working on the track. I was like, I need something extra here. I'm just going to throw in a Europa and some extra chords, and it will sound like this. So originally that was actually much lower in the mix, to the point where when I listened to it originally I was like, I'm sure there was supposed to be something extra here. Oh, it's this pad that's washing over everything. And it does still kind of get, it's sort of in the mix, it doesn't really stick out, which is pretty much what I was going for really. But I decided to add this phaser effect, which it's an emulation of the phaser from the Access Virus synth. And I really like the sound of that, so I just decided to throw that in and added a pump effect as well, just to kind of give it a bit more motion as the track progressed. There was also one extra stutter that I added around here, just because it needed something to kind of add to the transition, so I'm just going to play that. So originally that stutter, that kind of transitional effect wasn't there originally. I just decided to add that the day after just because I thought it'd be cool, and that's where the bass changes. So I felt like it needed something to kind of indicate that things were going to change up. Otherwise it just happened a bit too suddenly and didn't really work for me. So yeah, I think that's pretty much everything I changed in that track. I didn't really mess with the vocals, and the nasal riser stayed as it was. And I'm looking forward to bringing back the nasal riser in future. I mentioned earlier that something I'd really like to do in the future is some more shorter form tutorials. So the nasal riser that's going to happen. I'm going to have a nasal riser short tutorial and some other stuff like that. I think that'll be nice. And it's really, really nice to see how these techniques have kind of popped up during these streams. And I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have bothered trying the nasal riser if I'm sure someone suggested it, and that person is a legend for suggesting it. Because I feel like that's too crazy an idea for me to have come up with on my own. But yeah, so there we go. So that's pretty much all I changed really with Wayfarer. Thor Insider said, I wish the Cakewalk plugins were still available. Yeah, I completely forgot about that. It was a slightly awkward moment during the Reason Studio stream I did with Ryan a few weeks ago. I say a few weeks ago, it was probably more like a month ago now, where I just casually brought in the RE2A and totally forgot that you can't actually get that anymore. Yeah, I absolutely love it. It was an early rack extension purchase for me, and I'm so glad I got it. I remember when they started giving it away for free before it was discontinued, a few people were sort of pissed off because they'd paid for it. But I'd already had so much use out of it. It just seemed like, why would I be annoyed at the fact that more people are now getting to use it? Cakewalk did give away the VST equivalent after the fact. But again, I'm not entirely sure if you can even get that. And I've heard that it doesn't sound the same anyway, which I find kind of surprising. But there we go. I did get the VST version for free, but I've not really used it a whole lot. Buskin Bills has asked, can you re-download if you need to? Yes, I can. If any rack extension, even if it's discontinued, you can still download it if it's in your account. So I will always be able to get the RE2A. It just means that new customers can't purchase it, which is kind of a bummer. But the way the rack extension platform works is, even if they update how it works with Reason, it should always work basically, which is awesome. The RE2H doesn't get updates, but I can still download it, which is awesome. JLX76 has said, I picked up the McDSP compressor bundle on sale and they do a really good job. I was super tempted by that. It looked really, really tempting, but I think I talked myself out of it at the time because I was like, am I really going to use this at the moment? Not really. But that was a close one because that bundle looked really good. I can't really remember exactly why I talked myself out of that one, but I don't seem to be kicking myself over it yet. So there we go. It is great for vocals. I do use the RE2A all the time on vocals. It's that, and I also use the Selig Leveler. That's really good on vocals in particular. But this is just it's such a quick thing to throw in. You can load a vocal preset and it's just, there we go, done. Thor Inside says, what would you replace RE2A with in a mix if you didn't have it? I'd probably just use the SSL compressor, to be honest. I mean, they sound different, but I imagine if I had to, I would just, I don't know. I don't know, actually. I mean, it's one of those things, like, I'm not really sure what I'd replace it with because it sounds really good. So it's a pickle. So I'm just reading this comment from Ty Blue. After Adam 1 Stutter Edit 2 from Plugin Boutique, I decided to enter the competition last week. The question they posed was, comment a mixing technique that you have learned this year. I answered, I learned that knowledge and education is far more valuable than buying more plugins. Probably not the best answer considering what Plugin Boutique are all about. Oh, I love that. Oh, my respect for you is just, it's shot up just because of that. That's such a, I love that. Oh, but yeah, I didn't win. I love that attitude though. And I totally agree. I totally agree that you can have all the plugins in the world, but if you don't know how to use them, then what's the point? It's like the whole, would a if you had a regular person in a race car, would they outperform someone who, like a race car driver in a regular car? It's that kind of interesting comparison. And I'd say a lot of the time, the race car driver who knows what they're doing in a regular car would probably outperform the person who crashes straight into a wall when they use too many mastering plugins on their output bus. I mean, what? So yeah, I was very happy that I won Stutter Edit too. That was nice. But better luck next time, Ty Blue. You'll win the next competition. I must admit, when I entered the competition, they asked who you collaborate with. I was really tempted to just suck up and be like, yeah, I'd collaborate with BT. But then I was like, nah, I'm going to put Trent Reznor. So that was interesting. So anyway, I'm probably gonna leave this session there. And unless there's anything else anyone wants to ask me or go over in these projects, as I've mentioned before, the project files are all available in a Dropbox folder, which I'll just drop that into the chat. And if you're watching this on YouTube, there's a link to that in the description below, if I remember to add it. And you can grab all the live stream projects. There's some patches, there's bounces of everything in there, which have just come straight from Reason, no additional processing. So that's pretty much that. So if you're watching this on Twitch, I'll be sticking around for a little bit afterwards, just to kind of wind things down a bit. But if you're watching this on YouTube, then thanks so much for joining me. And I hope you'll join me for next week's music making session, unless I get sidetracked and do something completely unrelated. So thanks so much for joining me again, and hope to see you next time. Cheers. Bye-bye.